bit. Hopefully in the next 5 minutes I'll get an idea and I'll give it to you. Originally when Mark asked me to do this, I was reluctant. Because there's no honorarium. Are you getting paid? I'm deeply suspicious of the whole idea of doing a conference on home, particularly in an architectural institution. And I'm suspicious because of the way architecture seems to, home seems to exercise a kind of an obligatory force on architecture, the concept of home, the notion of home or the idea of home. And so I wondered, why are we doing home here now? Why not a conference on structure or a conference on popularity? Or notions that equally work within architecture but also outside to other disciplines. What is it about home that demands its thought in an architectural context? I think a good example of this is Mark's, for many of you that are at the AA, Mark gives a Friday lecture on danger and safety. And when we were meeting in executive meetings at the beginning of the year about what the topics of these lectures would be, and he said he wanted to do it on danger and safety, Alan was opposed to it because it didn't have enough cachet. Danger and safety were not quite sufficiently obligatory notions. He thought, what's this going to be? Is this going to be about fire escapes and rails? And, how are you going to talk about this for 26 weeks? And I've been coming every Friday, and Mark's been able to make fire escapes and railings quite interesting, I think. So anyway, the idea of the idea of home just didn't seem right to me. Home is kind of like a well-trained Jewish mother, in that it has the capacity to make some architects feel deviant and guilty when they know damn well they haven't done anything wrong. Worse than that, home can be like the Pope, in that it has the capacity to make other architects feel valorized and emboldened in their plodding mediocrity, because they become staunch defenders of a cause. Christopher Alexander and Robert Stern have declared their allegiance, for example, to homes rather than houses. And so I keep, what is it about home? So what you find is either an attack on home or a defense of home in the name of architecture. In either case, however, the notion of home exercises some kind of undue force, somewhat like a love-hate relationship. And so, maybe learning from Freud, I thought the best response in architecture to the notion of home was simply one of indifference. If you think a little bit about the idea, one of the reasons that one of the sources of this force is that home is always a phenomenological notion. Whether that phenomenology be a transcendental phenomenology, an existential phenomenology, a sociological phenomenology, or psychological phenomenology, its capacity to exercise undue force in the discipline emanates, I think, from its status as a phenomenology. And I guess personally I believe that a transformative architecture is really best conceived as a continuous projective assault on this and every other phenomenology. I think that's what we mean by transformative architecture. And I do believe that phenomenologies in any of its registers and any of its characters are, for political reasons, always to be the object of an assault. And so I thought what I would do today very quickly is to trace a line of a particular selection of houses that I've selected actually because of their deviancy. They're deviant in many registers, and I'll try to show the deviancies in them. But what I see them as is an assault on the notion of home by the architecture of the house. The argument that houses that I'm going to show are deviant exceptions and don't constitute a substantial argument in substance is going to be a key issue, because these are going to be rich people's houses, they're guest houses, you'll know them. In every case, they're not a house, they're not an architecture of the house which seems to bear directly on the question, the broad social and cultural question of the home. But I think it's really what I want to put into question here, and that is not so much are these deviant examples over and against a substantial question, but isn't the question of deviancy itself the the structure against which we have to operate on notions like home. So I'm going to move through the houses quickly. But I guess we should be, maybe I'll pose a few questions that we can just think about when we're looking at them. Who is the house for and who is it against? The ones I'm going to show, 4 houses. Who is at home in it and with it? And what are the architectural mechanisms in the house whose effects bear on these questions? First I'm going to shoot the screen with a laser. Take my cigarettes out. First slide, please. Oh, thank you. Okay, this is an old house. Thank you, Paul. Believe it or not, that's the only joke I could write for today. Actually, this is Hardwick Hall, and historically it does date from many years ago. And so I'm just going to play this one out. I've got it. It was done by a guy named Smithson. It was very early in his career, long before he did Spiral Jetty or Hunt Stanton House. So it's very early. Thank you, Peter. Okay, this is Hardwick Hall, as you know, 1593. Jacobean architect Robert Smithson. First introduction of Palladian architecture and Palladian planning into England, 16 years after the death of Palladio, 1580, as we all know. Now, this house was a bit of a scandal for 2 reasons. One is how much glass is on the front of it, and it's famous Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, is how you might remember it. Glass costs a lot of money. There's a glass tax in England. How many windows, you have to pay taxes for how many windows you have or how big your windows are, which of course makes a lot of sense. And so there was a scandal in its ostentation, and a scandal, because Bess was estranged from her husband, Bess Hardwick. I knew her quite well. Bess was estranged from her husband, and she had Smithson. She hired Smithson. 2 things are important. Smithson was an extremely fashionable architect, and she hired him to do this house and essentially worked with him on the major features of it, which are its glass, the amount of glass on the cover, on the facade, and the plan. And then what's interesting about the plan is it's the first house in England where you walk directly into the Great Hall. Right here, I'll show you some more pictures. Trey? Is that the laser? Where's the laser? Slapstick always goes. Can I hand this to somebody and say, next slide, please? Would you do that? Not that I can't do that, but by acting inept, I get to order somebody around. Okay, there it is, a lot of glass. Next slide, please. Back up. Back up. Other things, major center axis. So the entry is axial entry. We all know the politics of axial. Next slide. Okay, you enter directly into. Well, actually, this is the wrong plan. But you enter into the Great Hall. I didn't look at this very carefully. But trust me, you enter directly into the Great Hall. And the previous slide, please. Okay. So as you can see, you enter directly into the Great Hall. And what was important about this, of course, is in house planning before this, there was a whole series of screens and walls before you got to the Great Hall. So this direct, perspicacious entry into the hall was a new idea of planning. Bess, being estranged from her husband, is a key issue because she is a deviant client. Smithson, a highly fashionable architecture, is introducing deviant architecture into England. It quickly becomes fashionable and becomes the rage and essentially defines villa planning and country house planning afterwards. Next again. Okay, so essentially, I want to talk to you about glass houses. Glass houses is a deviant form of houses. Now, this is Mies Farnsworth house in Plano. I'll take my cigarette out of my mouth. Put this up here next to somewhere somebody else stored. And I'll pick that up later, Alan. Don't worry about that. Okay. Now, Miss Farnsworth was a widow, or was on her way to being a widow when she commissioned Mies. Well, I tried to do my history. When she commissioned Mies to do the house, it's quite clear that she was romantically attached to Mies. There's a lot of testimonial evidence to suggest that they were having an affair. She wanted to, I'll quickly show the systems of deviancy in here. What I believe she was trying to accomplish by building a house was to essentially live in and with Mies, and of course enable their affair. As soon as she breaks up with Mies, the house gets finished, and she starts publicly criticizing the house and condemning its architecture. Next slide. I'm sorry, go back one. As you can see, though, some of the issues are simple. Just like Hardwick Hall, it's an object in the landscape. In fact, an object in nature. Next slide. Although Mies starts to do some other things, he starts to try to develop a synthesis between Schenkelian neoclassicism, the neoclassicism of Schenkel, and the modernism. So it's a free-floating object in the field. The important thing is to notice is the sandwich top, sandwich at the bottom. So you get this sort of laminar space, but it continues the tradition of a free-floating object in the field. It's an assault on the house, but we were going to on the home. But we have to keep paying attention to the mechanism architecture used to accomplish that assault, and at the same time to reiterate, essentially reinstate the home. Next. So I'll go through this quickly. I'm quite sure you know this. So it has it's structurally detached from the ground, and then Mies tries to work out a very complicated condition, and that is how do you resolve the axial entry of classicism with oblique entries of modernism. Next slide. So he works out this very interesting podium structure. You come off the ground twice. He establishes what would have been the classical axis, and then you turn in on the secondary axis into the house. Next slide. There's the podium. What is that? Is that a motorcycle? Next slide. More pictures of the entry. Next slide. Okay, so there you can see after you come up the major axis, essentially, which would lead you back off the object, you then go into a secondary axis, which takes you into the house. So through this mechanisms and others, Mies is resolving his interest in modern space and modern spatial organization with neoclassical planning and massing. Next. The interior supports that. If you recall from the plan, there is no delimiting of space. There are no rooms in the Farnsworth house. All the furniture sits in a free field. It's not quite free planning, including, by the way, the bathroom and the service core, which floats in the space as an object to emphasize the laminar space. It's actually contained at top and bottom, but laminarly flows through the space. Next. And so all of the furniture is put to create a kind of interior cantilever right near the edge, so it exaggerates the openness into the corner, but being careful not to delimit. Use furniture or objects in the space to delimit subordinate organizations within the house. Next. In the same way, you can barely see this, but this is a service core. It sits like an object with no spatializing function. This is well known, I won't belabor it, but there's a tremendous attention to finding the clearest possible glass. So he actually specially commissions the production of high heat glass so as to reduce as much as possible the reflection, so as to create a kind of continuity in the open space between the podium, the porch, and the glass. He also detaches the structural system, so the structural system acts independently from the glass system, which acts independently from the floor and roof. both of which are fixed against the side, and then separates in scale the mullions for the glass from the structure of the building. Next. So I'm not going to give you an interpretation. I'm basically saying that deviancy in the architectural pursuit in terms, in very standard terms, form, material, structure, relationship to site, relationship to planning and programming, and also deviancy in the status of the client, and then the relationship between the client and the architect are ways that home gets assaulted. And we will also see that a key issue is how this assault on the home disseminates and reconfigures one of the mechanisms by which it reconfigures a new notion of home. Next. Okay, Philip Johnson is the next glass house I thought we would take a look at. Now, Mies, by the time Mrs. Farnsworth commissions him, is quite a fashionable architect like Smithson was. In 1948, when Philip Johnson decides to build his glass house, he's not yet a fashionable architect. In fact, he's a curator of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art. He's curating a show of Mies's work. He's going through the drawings in Mies's office. He finds a preliminary drawing from the glass house. He immediately quits the Museum of Modern Art, goes out and builds his own glass house and gets it built before Mies is built. So he basically steals the idea and gets all the public recognition that he knew would come from it. And he had a keen sense of publicity. And so he actually uses his glass house to become a fashionable architect, which he was really quite successful for. Now, we shouldn't misunderstand the client here. The client is not Philip Johnson building for himself. In 1949, Philip Johnson is just back from Germany, where he is freed or describes himself. In the 30s, he's there. He's back in the 40s. But he describes this period of his life in Germany as a place where he was comfortable with his own homosexuality and his own narcissism. In the States, he had to hide it. He came back, and so at this point, he's still hiding his homosexual relationships, which are all taking place in his apartment in New York City. So he basically goes out here on the weekend for himself. But the client here is there. What I'm saying is it's not Philip. The client here is a client who wants to live with himself as his sexual partner. So Philip has a real client. It's a client who wants to live with himself as his sexual partner. No one else ever comes out here with Philip until permanently or as a regular resident until 1963, when Philip meets David Whitney. They openly express their homosexual liaison, and David takes up residence at the glass house. Although I should say there's another house on the property, which is David's house proper. But the issues that Philip is attending to in the design are, I mean, obviously he doesn't set this as a program, but we should see them as in their contradiction to Mies and as another way of using architecture to look at to conduct this assault, which I'm talking about, on any kind of typological or standardized notion of the home. Architecture, in any case, as a place where the home is fulfilled. Now, he starts off, his approach to the site is quite different than Mies. He also is going to build his house in the landscape, but not in nature, because what this slide doesn't show. The slide does show the Acropolis effect, so he goes and finds a hill he can put the house on top of to create an Acropolis. It doesn't show how close it is to a suburban area, so that there's a great deal of voyeuristic relationship between his neighbors, the capacity of the neighbors to see in and him to see out. Next slide. And then in very famous ideas, or ideas he made famous about how he borrowed Greek planning, he puts several elements in and makes claims to have used the planning ideas identified by Choisy of Greek planning. And then he establishes a pool. The pool establishes a second ground. Next slide. Oh, back up one. This is Philip in his bathing suit. And this is Philip in his bathing suit. These are the two people that live in the house. Next. The official representations of the house is always going to be a theme, and it becomes, when we turn to the last house, becomes a key issue. Okay, this is the plan of the house. It's very different from Mies's. It's a caricature. The best way to think about Philip Johnson's glass house is as a caricature of a Georgian mansion. From the sense, he's building a glass house, and we'll see many of the mechanisms to oppose Mies's architectural position, to find a deviant use of modernism, and to support an entirely different domestic but not home arrangement. So we'll see in a second about the entrance. We come to the entry, and then he partitions all of the space with rooms. So there's a room. So it's basically a 9-square grid organization, just like you would find in a Georgian mansion, all done in 1,800 square feet, including a major hearth and great space. Next. So here's the entry. So it's an axial entry to the planning, but a central axis entry into the space. Now, you have to pay attention to the hearth, which is no longer simply an object in the space. It actually comes out the top, breaking the two planes, riveting like a staple to space, making it extremely contained, an effect which is exaggerated both in 3 ways. The corner treatment as opposed to Mies's cantilevered corner, the wainscoting, which is a caricature of wainscoted walls in the Georgian mansion, and this big staple, essentially, which grounds the house. Next. Now, the slide, and this is again showing his treatment of center entries and attaching the house to the ground as opposed to pulling it off the ground like Mies does. Next. And these are just some examples of how the interior is partitioned. It's not only partitioned in plan in terms of rooms. You find it's partitioned in sections. So there's actually 3 floors. There's a ground floor register, a secondary register established by works of art, and then a higher register. So it has all the 3 floors of a Georgian mansion. It has the same organization. It has the caricature of the walls. What I'm not able to show you is, well, go ahead. This is the art, which against the Nadelman sculpture establishes the register with a candelabra. This candelabra was designed by Philip, put in for this photograph. Here's the heart, and then taken out 6 weeks later because he didn't like it. I think a key issue, if you look at this Giacometti, Giacometti is, for many reasons, are famous. But one of the things that they are often thought of as having the capacity to do is to delimit infinite space. So you see a Giacometti on a contained space in another container, and you basically see the spatial organization of the house. You basically see infinite space recontained by boundary conditions. Actually, this little podium that the Giacometti sits on, if you turn it upside down, it's almost an exact duplicate of the organization of the house. Next. Giacometti was a plaster maquette. The plaster started to fall off. Philip sent it to Giacometti to be restored. Giacometti pulled all the plaster off, went down to the wire frame, and just before he was about to restore it, he died, so he never got the Giacometti back. There's the Nadelman sculpture. Next. Now, unlike, I guess none of these slides. Try one more slide. Okay, this is the corner detail. The structural system and the window systems are integrated as opposed to kept separate in Mies. The corners are riveted instead of cantilevered, and it's attached to the ground. You can get some sense of the glass in this photograph, but unlike Mies, what Philip does is he goes to great lengths to try to find the most reflective glass he can find, short of a mirror. So the house is not only highly reflective from the outside, but highly reflective from the inside. And perhaps the most famous photograph in the house is Philip sitting in his bedroom, or at his desk in his bedroom, looking at his reflections of the glass all over back and forth. And then you're looking in, watching Philip as a voyeur, watching these reflections. Next. So you can get some sense of the reflectivity here. I think this is, here's Philip. Next. Okay, the last house I want to talk about quickly is the fourth in this series of developments on the glass house, and the glass house as an assault on the home. This is Rem Koolhaas's, I think it's called Villa Dall'ava, is that right? In Saint-Cloud, Paris. Now, Rem was commissioned to do a glass house by a family in Paris, and they expressly wanted a treatment of or a reconsideration of Rem's house. Now, given this is the site that he has to work with. Given this site, Rem takes a look at the history of the glass house in Philip and Mies van der Rohe, and then the gestures he makes in terms of what would normally be considered to be the internal language of architecture, in material, in form and organization, in planning and programming and in site, coordinate to make a development of the glass house and antagonistic to the three previous cases. For example, in all three of the previous cases, the overriding theme is coordinating the effects into a coherent whole. And I think what you'll see in Rem's version of the glass house is an emphasis on incoherence. At this time, Rem, I think, is a fashionable architect. He's certainly fashionable in the architectural world, and in intellectuals who enjoy some relationship to the architectural world. The client for this house is an editor of an important art and architecture magazine in Paris. But fashionable certainly among architects and students. Next. These are examples of the site. Now, what's going to go on in the Villa Dall'ava is employing the site to the systems of deviancy there are going to be twofold. One is it's going to become a house for a family that doesn't live together. So the husband, the wife, and the daughter will operate in the architecture of the house so that they're as much in communication with the neighbors or not in communication with each other. So it's not that the house disrupts the communication, it's that the house creates a non-domestic context in which the communication among family members is equal to the communication among neighbors. And so there is a breakdown of the family by the house. Also, the house is saprophytic on its site. It will, instead of trying to create a situation where it's an isolated object in nature, as we saw in the other three houses, or to work out a kind of compatible relationship with the context, what Rem does at Dall'ava is to create a situation where the house feeds off of the context to create its disrupting effects. Now, I didn't choose the word parasitic, because a parasite is a living creature that lives off another living creature. What actually I think you find here is it's saprophytic. Saprophytes are living creatures that live off dead creatures. And so what I think Rem's house does is actually feeds off the deadness of the other buildings and the context. It steals their space, it steals their material representation. It's actually, the word you more often hear is appropriates, and I think a better way to think about it is to see how it steals from its context. But it's absolutely dependent on the existence of this suburban context for its effects. So unlike the other three houses, it actually needs a kind of negative context to support its effects. Next. Just another image of the site. The slides aren't very good, but it would be important to see the color of the red brick and the sectional organization of the hill. Next. As well as a nice view to the Eiffel Tower. That's the house. Right, next slide. Okay. Now, sets up the house, but by using this T diagram on the site, it begins to capture spaces essentially which don't belong to him. Interestingly enough, by pulling away from the edge conditions, the boundary conditions, he actually extends the range of the way that the house commands space in other people's yards. And so in photographs you can see this, and when you visit this, you never know if you're in this person's yard. There's a hedge here but you're up and high enough that you're constantly looking into the other people's houses and other people's yards, but they can't look back. Next. Now, there are two plans, I think, that are important. One is, this is the glass house plan, and you can see it as a kind of development of Phillips and Mies. The objects in here are no longer partitioning spaces in the sense of organizing a plan, but actually squeezing spaces and making all the space in the house either interstitial or residual. So the way he sets up screens and other devices to interrupt the transparency and the voyeuristic function is a development of the plan into programming. A little bit, in a moment, I'm going to try to make the point that what happens in this house is that plan and program become separate. So there is a program to the house which is no longer part of its planning function, a series of event programming. The other thing is to work out irrational entries into the house and entries that are ill-defined from the carport. Next. Now this is the roof plan of the house. It's totally incoherent, or not totally, it's incoherent in its coordination with the glass house. The glass house sits in the center register. There's a bit below it and a bit above it. Next. Okay, that was just another idea about the entry. Another slide showing the entry. Next slide. Okay, so this is the glass house portion. So now all of the object which was started to protrude at the top in Phillips' house now becomes grotesque and exaggerated, and he uses that to divide the house into event spaces. This is the space for the man. The father of the house occupies this space. His piano's on this space. There's no real meeting room. This is the space, the master bedroom, but the woman is identified in the house by her relationship to the swimming pool. So the master bedroom is actually the woman's space, and it has specialized relationship to the swimming pool. There's a third, the other cantilever space on the other side is the daughter's space. So the programming of the house has much more to do with specific identifications of members of the family in their relationships. Next. This is the master bedroom, and this is you can see the glass house with a kind of grotesque mass sitting on top of it. And there's a floor under this, and what you can see how it looks over into all of the adjacent spaces. But as you'll see in a second, you can't see that again. Next. Okay, I can do it. I can do it sideways. They can turn their head. Go back one. Not that hard. So, should I talk about this one while you're fixing it? Okay. This material, this cheap material, is chosen not only to take advantage of the more expensive material of the other houses, but also it exactly matches the hue of the red brick. The slide doesn't show it. There's also a tennis court right here, which this red also matches the surfacing of it. So there's this constant drawing of relationships that extend the space of the house outside its boundaries. If you were a reader of Deleuze, you might call these an affiliative effect. But the incongruence and incoherence of the house, the fact that it's a loose adhesion, which actually breaks down into other relationships, is one of the key issues. The house is actually dissolved, in a sense, on the site by its site relationships, as is true for the program of the family that lives in it. This is the woman's space. Next. Now, this is a continuation of the glass house. Right here is the neighbor's house. It's so close. This space is the asphalt. The house is so close here that when you're walking down this window, you absolutely see in the house. these people took Rem to the Supreme Court to stop him from building this house. Instead, they built this wall, which acts as a screen. It squeezes the space, and as you'll see, the space unfolds. But this wall acts as was supposed to legally act to stop these people from seeing out. But essentially, what it does is allows them to view their neighbors through these portholes by stopping the neighbors from seeing in. So it becomes a kind of optical device by which to extend the visual field of the house. Next. And then this is that wall from another point of view. Next. Okay. And then as you come around the wall on this side, you see that this space turns into the major space. Next slide. Now, structure, unlike the debate on structure that's occurring between Philip Johnson and Mies van der Rohe, structure works in, this slide is upside down. Why is that funny? This is upside down. Here's how you know. You see all those little dots on the roof up there? That's where it's easy to okay. Structure works, again, it's a development in REM to increase the level of incoherent adhesion and particularization both of the space and the program. But you cannot tell what the structure is. There is either excessive structure or impoverished structure. There's either too much structure or not enough structure at every point in the house. And so there's a kind of dissimulation of structure which constantly creates the effect of not knowing what the organizational core of the house is. Next. The other thing is the house is, it becomes necessary to represent the house differently. This is the white Miesian couch, which is normally seen on the interior, which Rem actually pulls outside and photographs from. Now, it's a kind of trick slide, but essentially he's trying to find a strategy which shows the spatial and programmatic principles of the house accurately. It's not just that there's a breakdown of inside and outside in a modern sense, in the way that Mies tries to erase the difference between the outside and the inside. Same thing with Frank Lloyd Wright. Philip Johnson tries to reinstate it in decisive fashion. What happens here is it's interrupted. So what belongs inside is outside, what belongs outside is inside. There's a necessity to invent this representation to show both the spatial structure and the event structure of the house. Next. And then you'll see the classical debate about how you treat the corner is also subverted and dissimulated. Next slide. Because all of the corners open up. So that recreation of the Philip Johnson corner of the glass house, when these windows open up, recreates the cantilever of the Mies van der Rohe house. So there is no decisive core theme. There's no decisive organization. There's not there's no nuclear family. There's no nuclear site. There's no program structure, planning structure, or structural system which enables any kind of decisive context to be decided. Arbitrary context or arbitration to be decided. This is the couch which is used for that photograph. Next slide. The only way I can show you this. This is the cantilever of the master bedroom in the woman's space. This is the cantilever for the daughter's space. There's an excess of structure here, rendered irrationally, and no structure here, even though they're structurally equivalent in a cantilevering beam. So either there's not enough columns here, or there's too many columns here, or you don't know what structure is doing in the space. Next. Let's stop, don't fix this. Same thing is true with the structure that holds up swimming pool. Next. Next. Okay. This is if you were to ask how do the family members relate to each other, where you see the conversations occurring most frequently is this wall slides open, this wall slides open, this wall slides open. The daughter talks to the father, talks to the mother. So the conversation, the structure, this is now what I'm talking about, the program of the house is no longer part of the planning. It's part of the event structure of the house. And the conversational relationships that occur among the family members are identical to the ones that would occur between family members and neighbors. So there is no home here. There is an eddy in a kind of urban, suburban field which allows a provisional collection of people with some relationships to come together. Next. This is the bathroom. I thought I'd close on the bathroom. The bathroom is outside. You can open a door. You can open a door to the bathroom. You can take your bath and shower outside. You can change the wall so that you come down from the swimming pool and use it as a showering. But the bathroom is not in the service core, either rendered as object or hearth by Johnson or Vanderohe. It actually sits on the outside, and you can open and close the space off. Next. And so it becomes impossible to say not only what the house is, but for who is it a home. Essentially, it's occupied by a politic, not a family. Next slide. So, some closing remarks. Now, I think if we look quickly at the history of the glass house, we can see, and whether I've done it well or poorly, I shouldn't be the test of the argument. You can see what I've called an assault on the tradition of the home through the architecture of the glass house. We could have chosen other trajectories. We could have looked at Liz Diller and Rick Scafidio's Slow House and their use of video and glass windows, or the opposing TVs against fireplaces. Constantly, architecture is trying to contest the degree to which home obligates the house. And I think the series of slides that we've seen perhaps gives some idea about what history that outlines. However, the last deviancy I think that I'd like to suggest is the deviancy of how this disseminates, because suppose you could accept this argument, but at the same time you would say, look, there's too many, nobody can afford, very few people can afford these houses. There's virtually no way that they enter the public realm. However interesting this may be, it has to do with the hermetic sort of self-interested and self-indulgent activity which constitutes architectural speculation, and in that sense which has no larger bearing on the social or political questions to which it's more directly responsible, and would be obligated through a notion like home. Which is why I've paid so much attention to the role of fashion, all four of these being fashionable architects, because what actually happens is that without any good understanding, without any historical understanding or intellectual understanding of these effects, they will disseminate through a broader architecture precisely through the mechanisms of fashion. They will either be fashionable architects for clientele, or they will be fashionable to students. Students will look at their pictures in magazines, misunderstand them, not deal with them with integrity, but the effects will begin to disseminate. And just like Hardwick Hall disseminated through the entire English, early 18th century English, am I right about it? Okay, early 18th century English housing, so will all of these effects. The cantilever, the treatment of glass, they will not have the stature of a thoughtful speculation when it's done by the initiating architect, but nevertheless they will take on a political effect. And I suppose what I wanted to close with is a claim that fashion becomes the premier mechanism by which deviancy in architecture disseminates and undermines various pseudo-phenomenologies. Like a symptom or a dream, fashion allows deviancy to be expressed without the necessity of intellectual consciousness. So, thank you. Sure. Any questions? Tanya Harding is skating at... No questions?
Just wanted to finish before Tanya Harding comes on the TV.